You're listening to Shift, Human First Financial Guidance with Ross Marino.
Today, we are shifting the conversation with Peter Nakata, Chief Education Officer at Stonebridge Asset Management. Hello, Peter.
Hey, Ross, how are you?
I am good. Thanks for being on the show today. I've read some of your work. I've been looking forward to having you on. Maybe everybody out there doesn't know who you are. How about you just take the first 30 seconds and introduce yourself?
Sure. So my title, as you pointed out, is Chief Education Officer. And folks out there might not have ever heard of that because we sort of made it up. I used to be Chief Marketing Officer for Stonebridge. And then I realized I wasn't really marketing as much as I was explaining what we do, right? And it was more like teaching and explaining. And so we came up with this title, Chief Education Officer, which I think more accurately explains what I do, number one. And number two, I always wanted to be CEO, and now I can be.
I love that. So we're going to talk about reducing anxiety in the post-paycheck phase of life. And before we dive into that, I've been an advisor for decades, and this is probably the first real human first experience I had with clients. And what I mean is I noticed how if they were working on Friday and that was their last day of work, they retired, and then next Monday, they were now a retired person, things changed. Now, I know that may sound simple that things changed, but I certainly noticed the emotions on Friday. Maybe they felt like they had enough money for retirement, but then Monday comes and once they're retired, now they're not so sure. So I remember seeing this dramatic shift early on in my career. It's still present today. This is something that you're going to talk about. So how about we start with just defining what you mean by post-paycheck phase of life? Is that retirement or is it something else?
Yeah, we came up with this notion of post-paycheck phase of life to highlight something important. And that is when people think of retirement, they think of the part of it that's not working anymore, which is certainly a thing, right? You have more time to devote to your hobbies, your family, travel, that sort of thing. But there's another, perhaps more important thing from a psychological perspective. And that is, it's the first time in your adult life that you're not earning a paycheck, right? And in some ways, that's a more dramatic shift, right? You're used to every month getting a paycheck, and you're used to being very comfortable spending that paycheck. And now in this post-paycheck phase of your life, all of a sudden, you're not working anymore, but more importantly, you're not getting that paycheck. And one of the advisors that we've worked with said they should coin a phrase for the time that starts when you don't get your first paycheck until you start receiving Social Security. And it's kind of the valley of anxiety or something like that. But that is what we mean by post-paycheck.
Yeah, sounds more like the dark ages to me working with clients. It's a challenging time. They go in from being what seems like rather comfortable to all of a sudden not real comfortable. So how about you talk about some of the psychological and behavior changes you see in people as they enter that post-paycheck period of their lives?
Absolutely. So let's think about what your psychology is during the paycheck phase of your life. You're used to being comfortable spending your paycheck, investing some of it, saving some of it, and that all feels good. All of a sudden now, you're in a phase where you are not getting that paycheck and you're having to spend what you make off your portfolio, and then you're actually having to spend down some of your portfolio, and that can be very unsettling. And the handful of things that happen with this are, number one, you get very sensitive to things like volatility. If you have this pile of money and you need it to last for the rest of your life, a downturn in the stock market, if you're invested in stocks, can be a real problem. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is you get pretty sensitive to inflation. So let's suppose you invest in fixed income and you have a nice steady income. What about inflation? So if you're looking at retirements that can last 20, 30, 40 years now, that can cause a huge decline in the purchasing power of whatever fixed income you have. So that's number two. And maybe the biggest thing is number three is that people get really sensitive to longevity, right? So if you plan your money to last you to 90, there's a good chance that you live to 100, in which case you have a potential $1 million uh-oh if you're spending 100,000 a year, let's say. So those are really the three big things that shift in terms of psychology that create anxiety: volatility, inflation, and lifespan.
Yeah, those are three important aspects. And as I'm listening to you, I'll go back to the first part that you mentioned, which is when you go into that no paycheck zone. And I think you see with clients where for years they're saving, they're preparing their nest egg. And then all of a sudden, there's no more money going into the nest egg because there's no more income. That alone is a shock to them. And then all of a sudden, you'll see what often I see is the risk tolerance from their perspective changes. And it really didn't change from last Friday to this Monday because it's not as big a deal to us because they still have maybe that long-term time frame. And I want to talk about that next. But in their perspective, all of a sudden that nest egg it's like the golden egg. And they're afraid. They don't want to take risk. They don't want to have the volatility. They're incredibly sensitive to it. So I appreciate that you bring that up because I've seen that with people over and over and over. And I wonder your perspective. I know as advisors, we look at the numbers, we use financial planning software. We know the odds of someone living to age 90. Do you think investors actually think about that number and understand it?
Absolutely not. I think what has happened is that over time, life expectancy has crept up. And importantly, it's crept up more for people that have means, right? And it's a bit of a sad statistic, but for the folks that we're talking about that have financial advisors, their life expectancy is about 90 right now, which surprises a lot of people. That means 50% of the people are going to live longer than 90, 50% shorter than 90. And there's a 7 to 8% chance of living to 100. That really blows people away because it used to be very, very rare. Now we're sneaking up on 10% of the people living to 100, which is very surprising. And when I talked about the difference between the people that use financial advisors and don't, the average population life expectancy is about 84. And that's what I think a lot of people mentally cue on is that 84. But now we're talking about life expectancy for the wealthier people being a full 6 years longer than that. So that's a big deal. And I don't think people are necessarily prepared for that. Having said that, they are anxious, as you point out. They're anxious. They know that there's a possibility of that. And so they end up spending less than they might because they are self-insuring against this possibility that they live to 100.
I've certainly seen people fall into a couple different camps in my experience. One is the parents didn't live that long and they think, you know what? I'm on bonus time anyway. If I make it past 75, my parents died at 70, I'm going to be okay anyway. And it's hard for them to grasp that the odds say they could live to 90 or beyond. But then you have the ones where they have a parent that made it into their 80s or into their 90s. I tend to find that crowd, they get it. And maybe they don't believe deep down that they could live that or that they will live that long, but they know it's a possibility because there's mom or there's dad or there's the grandparents. So I think when you see that longevity, that probably changes your perspective. What do you think?
Absolutely. And what I'll point out is in either case, it's the financial advisor's responsibility to make sure that they are covered in case they live to 100. But you're exactly right. A lot of people's psychology is informed by what they've experienced either in their families or in their circle of friends. The other big thing that's shifted is we are now entering the first generation where the defined benefit pension plan is a thing of the past, really. I know my father worked for AT&T for his whole career, retired with a nice pension, and that took care of his spending needs. And I think a lot of folks these days are now looking at that saying, we don't have that kind of thing. We have Social Security, which provides for a portion of spending, but we now have to make up for the rest of it, and we need to deal with this idea of making it to 100. But in either case, what I was saying is it's really the financial advisor's responsibility to make sure that folks in both of those buckets, not just the ones who have seen their parents or friends living well into their 90s, but also those folks that aren't acquainted with them, to make sure that they are prepared for that possibility.
I think I've seen a lot of advisors over time work with clients that are going into retirement, and that sensitivity to no paycheck leads some advisors to say, well, we just need more fixed income and we just need more income because you're going to have that through retirement. It sounds good at first blush. Well, you're right. I do need more income, but there's a problem with that long term. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So remember, go back to the three challenges that I laid out first when you enter the post-paycheck phase of your life. Number one, market volatility. Number two, inflation. And number three, longevity. So now traditional fixed income deals with the first. In most environments, it's a pretty stable investment. Now in 2022, we saw even bonds can suffer when rates went up a lot, can suffer a total return hit. But generally speaking, especially if you're buy and hold, it provides you with a relatively low volatility source of income. In terms of inflation, not so great. Now, there are tips. There are the inflation protected treasuries, but based on what we see, very few financial advisors really put their clients into tips because they are a little bit complex to understand and to see how they actually work. And then number three, bonds have a fixed maturity, right? So they're not responsive at all to an investor's lifespan. So if you plan your bond investments to cover you through to 90 and you end up living to 100, you could be in trouble. So those are really the three things that bonds are not great at.
I remember receiving calls from people, prospective clients that owned TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities. And when inflation went up, they just didn't understand why the value of their bonds had gone down so much, because they were told, or at least their understanding was, oh, well, the yield moves with inflation. Like, oh, well, that sounds great. Didn't really understand how maturity works and what a 10 or 20-year bond actually means when rates go up and how that impacts them. So that was certainly challenging to a lot of people out there. Now, I know I was guilty of this many years ago as an advisor. I used to just think total return, right? Because that's what matters at the end of the day. It's total return. That's part of being a math geek. But as you become a financial planner, you realize, oh, it's a lot more than just math. But I know I was guilty of just thinking that way. Why don't we talk about why it's a challenge to just think about total return and how that may not be best for people?
Absolutely. So if you think about what your challenge is in the post-paycheck phase of your life, you have two things to deal with. One is you are dealing with the total return on your investments. You would like things to increase in value, but you also have to think about, how do I get money out of my portfolio in order to spend it? And if you are just managing to a total return perspective, you might be inclined to, let's say, I'm going to invest money in fixed income so that I can make sure I don't have too much volatility. And I'm going to spend the coupons on that. And I'm managing the whole thing to a total return. And I'm going to pass on the principal to my heirs. So that sounds like a good plan. The problem with that plan is really summed up in one word, and that is taxes. So if you have that fixed income in a taxable account, which many folks do if they're at a certain level of wealth, you are getting triple taxed on the coupons that come off that fixed income portfolio. You're getting taxed at ordinary income. Likewise, if you're spending the dividends on the stock portfolio that you have, you're also getting triple taxed on that as income. And if you have a client that's got in a higher tax bracket, that can really be painful. And so the idea of figuring out a way, instead of holding the principal and spending the coupons, if you could figure out a way to maximize the amount of principal that you can return during somebody's life, that's a much more tax efficient approach because that principal comes back to you at zero tax. So you think about zero versus the 30% that you might pay on federal, state, and local taxes. That's a huge difference. And it's something that we think advisors should be thinking hard about, because at the end of the day, it's not just total return, but it's total return after your taxes.
I've noticed that regardless of how much money or net worth someone has, they still have a basic question, which is, am I going to be okay? I remember talking with families who had $5 million, $10 million, and this is still an issue for them. And being a young financial planner, being the math geek, I'm looking at what they spend. I look at their needs. I look at their portfolio, and I think, why is this a question? Of
Yep.
course you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay for 100 lifetimes. I
Yep.
can't come up with a scenario in financial planning software that says, here's where I think you might not be okay, but they still feel that way. That is an issue. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And you think about what's happening in those scenarios is you haven't separated out the source of the income that you need in order to live on from the growth portfolio that you have that you want to leave to your legacy. It's all mushed together into one. So mentally, you're thinking, I need to grow this portfolio. And the way to do that is to minimize the amount of stuff you're taking out of it. Why not ring fence some of it? Why not say, I'm going to take a portion and let's make it as small a portion as possible. Make it the most return and tax efficient way possible for me to get money out to make sure I have a comfortable lifestyle. And then the entire rest of the portfolio can be managed like a multi-generational trust, right? You can invest that like the Yale endowment. But meanwhile, I very deliberately said, I'm going to take a small part of those assets and use those to generate what is in effect paychecks for me for the rest of my life. And that last part is important too, because if you don't do it for the rest of your life, you still have that anxiety of what if I live to 100?
It's certainly common in my experience with almost every investor, in my experience, that if their bills are X amount, they're most comfortable seeing X amount in income. They love to see those numbers match up. It doesn't matter that they have so many millions out there or how much income is being generated inside a retirement account. When it comes to the money that comes to them, if they spend X amount each month, they are most comfortable having X amount in income each month. It's something that I think a lot of advisors underappreciated, but to be able to identify those cash flows and to do it in a tax efficient way, we know that people are comfortable doing that. Any final words before we sign off?
Yeah, I wanted to underscore the emotional aspects of this, right? This is human first. And I was speaking at an RIA Client Appreciation Day a few months ago, and I was explaining how they could address these issues. And at the end of my presentation, one of the end clients came up to me. He was a big bear of a man, 72 years old, and he wanted to know what his options were. He said, I have $300,000 saved up. What can I do? How can I generate reliable income for the rest of my life? And I walked him through the math. And as soon as I finished, without thinking, he reached out and hugged me. The guy actually hugged me. The first time in my professional career anyone had ever hugged me. It was a little awkward, but it was much more satisfying than it was awkward, because it was a pure expression of happiness and relief at the prospect of having his retirement income needs met. So that's what I call human first financial service.
Just knowing that he's going to be okay is worth a hug. Great story. Thanks for sharing that with us. Peter Nakata, appreciate speaking with you today.
Thanks, Ross.
Thank you for listening to Shift with Ross Marino. Please visit humanfirst.live to learn more. This show is for general information purposes only and is not intended to provide recommendations or advice. Speak with a legal, tax, or financial advisor before making any decisions. Past performance references are historical and do not guarantee future results.